Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harjit Bhabra. I'm the Dean of the Sobey School of Business at St. Mary's University. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Black Business Initiatives, 25 Years and Beyond. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is the first of 3 conversation series that the Sobey School is launching in partnership with the Black Business Initiative. Through these conversations, we want to celebrate the contributions and resiliency of Black businesses in Atlantic Canada and identify challenges and opportunities for Black businesses in the post-COVID economic environment. The webinar is hosted by the Sobey School of Business Community Revitalization and Prosperity Network. The network is a project that is exploring how we can come together out of the current crisis stronger and more prosperous than before. It is mobilizing the expertise that exists within the Sobey School of Business and encourages participation of industry groups, business owners, and community leaders. We believe that by bringing together academic and operational expertise, we find the best solutions to the problems we face. Our panelists today are Dr. Rustam Southwell. Dr. Southwell is the CEO of Black Business Initiative. Over 2 decades, Rustam has worked diligently to guide many budding and established Black entrepreneurs through the arduous journeys of business ownership and help creation and expansion of hundreds of Black businesses, not only within our province and parts of Canada, but also globally across the US, the Caribbean, and beyond. Dr. Southwell holds honorary degrees in law and from St. Mary's University and Dalhousie Universities, and an honorary diploma from the School of Business at Nova Scotia Community College. We also have with us today Ms. Cynthia Dorrington. Cynthia is the president of Vail and Associates Human Resource Management and Consulting. As president, Cynthia does consulting work with small to medium-sized organizations across various industry sectors, from startups to businesses undergoing growth to mergers and acquisitions, with emphasis on strategic positioning of its human resources and managing change. Aside from a Canadian business endeavors, Cynthia is a principal partner in an Australian business venture. Cynthia currently is the chair of the Black Business Enterprise and chair of the HR, Governance and Nominations Committees for Africville Heritage Trust, Halifax Hospice, and Canadian Urban Institute. She is a commissioner on the board of Nova Scotia Human Rights and a lifetime member of Board of Governors for the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. Finally, we have Dr. Harvey Miller, a professor of operations management at the Sobey School of Business. Dr. Miller is an accomplished researcher in industrial engineering and an avid advocate of Black communities in Nova Scotia. He is also a jazz music enthusiast and has many music-related achievements. To mention the least, he is the leader of the group Harvey Miller and the Freedom Jazz Band and released award-winning music labels. And I must say that you always learn something new. I did not know that Dr. Harvey Miller was such a fantastic jazz music player, so I'll have to listen to that at some point in the School of Business. So before turning things over to our panel, I want to quickly discuss the format for today's webinar. You are all muted for this session. We will begin the panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session. If you want to ask questions, you can send using the question box on your control panel. Questions can be sent at any time during the presentation and will be answered during the Q&A period. Once we begin the Q&A session, we will answer as many questions as time permits today. So without further delay, let me get started with our first panelist, Dr. Rustam Southwell. Rustam, let me begin by asking you this. If you know that African Nova Scotians have been part of our community, of the economic and social fabric of this region for more than 200 years now. From your own experience as the founding CEO of BBI and an ardent advocate for the community for over 3 decades now, how has the Black business community evolved over this time? Also, as a province and a region, are we truly valuing the contribution of the Black business community in our region, you think?
Thanks very much, Harjit and Cynthia and Harvey. Nice to see you. I guess the BBI actually, its own inception was 1996 to address specific and unique challenges by the Black community. But historically, as far back as the 1700s, the Black community had been hardworking with many efforts and many champions, including people like Viola Desmond, who have championed the need for entrepreneurial and business development in these communities. If you look at the environment that BBI came in around 95, there were several consultations across the province that gave rise to the task force, one by the government led by the late Grace White, championed by people like Wayne Adams, who was in the Savage government, and Mr. Dingwall, the current president of Cape Breton University, who at that time was a federal politician, who saw the necessity for better integration in Black business owners into the economy, because Black communities have historically been extremely hardworking and extremely entrepreneurial, but never had tools, information, and necessary financing to actually make a significant impact. So there we were in 1996, trying to create an initiative that would change the dynamics. And so I've as we would say, reimagining service excellence directed at Black communities. What we've seen since is that even though we've had significant success based on our resources, there's still a lot more to be done. We've actually started that path in many ways, and that's going to continue. So to answer your question in terms of the impact, that sector has always been necessarily a challenge for us, because we felt that, for one, it was undervalued. Two, we hadn't fully noted the full capacity and capability of significant business owners who were making that change and that difference. Currently, there's a new energy for reasons that we'll go into, but we are seeing that significant shift as we at the BBI say, as we try to be changing lives by enabling economic independence. So that's currently what we're saying. I sort of missed what the second question was, but I think generally that's where.
So the second question really was like, so in terms of looking at the province and this region in the country, do you think that we are really truly valuing the contributions of Black businesses in our region?
Well, and that's a good point. One of the things that I actually did about a year ago or so is try to show the full impact of Black businesses, in particular in Nova Scotia, the unrealized sales level. And we figure in the inception of BBI from 1996 to roughly around now, the companies in the Black community are contributing over $1 billion in sales. And most people wonder, how is that possible? But if you think of it, most of the larger companies are doing more than 50, 60 million combined. And you just need to multiply it to see how quickly that adds up over 20 years. But there's been significant leaders. Dr. Abby Kiramura was the guy who discovered or developed the first dry AIDS tests and ran his company, Biomedica Diagnostic, in Windsor. And that was a significant company that's with very good sales. Everybody have heard the stories of Mike Duck when you go to a Tim Hortons and get a double-double. The precision pouring machines was created by a Black entrepreneur who's doing quite well. And then you have people like Larry Gibson with Dance to the Floor Plus More, Bin Doctor, Carvery's painting, and so many other good stories. That there's a significant wealth of strong entrepreneurs doing business. But they're also the smaller business owners, the folks who are now doing Black on Gudgeon, those pop-up sections who are doing those areas, are also creating the economy, because a collective of small businesses tend to hire and grow more quickly with those communities, even though they're a lesser sales. So we need both. Where it's important that we move to next is in the digital economy. So no, it's still an untapped resource that not recognized for its worth.
Thank you, Rustam. So that is very, very insightful. I mean, I think it's, it's interesting to know that there is so much happening, but I guess collectively, there's not a lot out there in terms of, people don't know about the amount of work that is happening out there, in the Black entrepreneurship community, really. So it's important to let the word go out for, so that there's more inspiration in our region as well. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Let me now turn to Cynthia. So Cynthia, I know that you are deeply involved with the Black business community through your own works and other advocacy roles that you hold. From your own perspective as a successful Black businesswoman and a business leader, what do you think are some of the key challenges and obstacles that the Black entrepreneurs and businesses face today in navigating, the current economic landscape that we have here?
I think some of the challenges we're facing today are challenges that we have faced in the past. One of them is, of course, financing. And the Black community, some of our businesses are grassroots type businesses, so and small businesses. So we may not have what it takes to actually finance businesses. And when you go to traditional routes, sometimes you don't have the collateral as well to actually ask for loans. So it's trying to find the financing to be, first of all, the startup of the business. Secondly, I think it's once you're in business, it's making sure you're able to grow your business. Some of that comes with coaching, some of that comes with mentoring, it's business advisory. Sometimes when you're working in the business, it's hard to pull yourself out of the business to work on the business. And in order to grow your business, one knows we have to work on it and not just in it, because in it you only grow to a certain aspect or a certain level. To grow beyond that level, you have to work outside of that. So you're working really on the business and not in. The other one, sometimes the challenge is when we look at our business sectors here in Nova Scotia, we're not in all sectors. And sometimes it's hard to break into those sectors. Some of that comes from education. Some of that also comes from the fact that we are not provided with the opportunities in those sectors to actually navigate into them. So again, when the system was created, and as Rustam alluded to, we have been here, Blacks have been here in Nova Scotia for hundreds of years, but for the last 250 plus years, we have been here and navigating the business environment. And when barriers have been put up to success for Black entrepreneurs, then it's hard to remove a barrier because it's not our barrier to success. It's the business barriers that have been put in there, systemic barriers that are hard to navigate, hard to break down, and hard to actually articulate. Although we can articulate them, the business community does not want to articulate them to the same degree to say we do have these barriers and how can we get beyond them? How do we work together as a group to get beyond them? And in order to do that, we have to actually identify them. We have to work as a collective, and all voices have to be at the table. It's not a one-sided voice saying what is needed by us. I think we know what's needed, but we have to articulate that to make sure it's heard, make sure it is done in a way that's respectful of our culture, because there are cultural nuances that we have to take into effect too, which sometimes can be a challenge. And if you look at some of the businesses that we do have, and successful businesses in Nova Scotia, some of them are outside of the scope of traditional businesses as we know it. Again, Rustam alluded to some of those businesses that have been innovative in nature, and as a result have moved beyond the barrier of Nova Scotia. So we have to sometimes, although thinking small, we have to start thinking big. And again, when we don't have those mentors or the coaching to move that way, when we're working in the business versus on the business, we're not seeing what the next big opportunity may be, because sometimes we're just surviving and not really thriving. And I think we have a lot of businesses that are surviving and starting to move through the thriving mode based on some of the things that have just taken place over the last year or so, especially with an influx of federal monies coming in from the federal government for Black entrepreneurs. And I think these are things that have been coming for and have been talked about for a very long time. But working with Black businesses, the challenge I would say is really having them understand their worth, because they are very worthwhile. What they do is just as important as somebody else, but sometimes we don't have that. We haven't heard it. We don't know that we are as valuable. And every time you move that yardstick, we have to reward each other. We have to praise each other, and we have to promote each other, because if we're not doing it, we're not always hearing it from the outside. And I think sometimes we have to be the cheerleaders, the champions. We have to really do a lot for businesses outside of just running the business, because you just can't do it in isolation off cheering and champion other Black-owned businesses that are walking beside you on this journey.
Thank you, Cynthia, very much. You spoke about a couple of things there, and you talked about, like, there being some systemic barriers, for Black entrepreneurs and businesses, not just here, but I guess across Canada overall, I would think. And I think you alluded to one of them, which was, for example, access to capital. You said, like, if you don't have collateral, it's difficult for entrepreneurs to really, have access to capital. But you also mentioned something about, like, that Black businesses are not in some of those some sectors. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Which particular sectors, for example, like, where they would like to be in and have not been able to make a lot of inroads so far?
You'll find sectors like the aerospace sector, for example, sectors that have more of the science and technology, the IT sector, where we tend to be more in traditional sectors because we're homegrown, more businesses. And as we start to develop and have the opportunities to actually partake in those sectors, then we'll grow in those sectors. But those sectors have been around for a period of time. The barriers for people migrating in that sector might have been put into place, and we have to actually navigate through. So when you're looking at the aerospace sector, that has been around for a long time, but we are not seeing a lot of Black-owned businesses that are in that sector doing a lot of work in that sector. Understand there are employees in that sector, but they're not businesses in that sector. And again, we go to more traditional businesses that will allow us, or start traditional businesses that will allow us to start business or get into business. And sometimes we have to be innovative. And I think what we need to do now is really look at those sectors we're not in and navigate ways and come up with strategies on how to mitigate that, move into that sector, and show that we have the wherewithal, we have the opportunities, and we have the strive and energy to be in the sector, and we can thrive in these sectors. So again, when you're looking at the aerospace, when you're looking at IT, you're looking at any innovation, and sometimes those innovations have an engineering background. We have to really look at how we get the people in the right spots with the right skills and competencies to move forward into these particular sectors, but promote them to help them into these sectors, because sometimes they may need that promotion, they may need that boost in order to get into these sectors, because again, they're closed sectors to some of the Black entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so that was very enlightening. Thank you very much. Let me move on to Harvey. Harvey, I know that you have done some very fascinating research work. Of late, at least, you've been working on the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic, on the Black businesses and Black entrepreneurs. Would you like to share some work that you've done in the last few months?
Hi, Harjit. How are you doing?
Thank you.
Cynthia and Rustam, good to see you guys as well. I'm just going to see if I could share the appropriate screen here. Just bear with me for a second. This is a lot easier on Zoom. I'm trying to figure this out. A screen is shared, right? Correct? But it's not. But it's the wrong screen. I'm trying to figure out how do I get to, because I got 3 screens in front of me. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out if I may just give me 1 second.
So in terms of the research, as Harvey is looking at slide up, it was some support from Nova Scotia Business Inc. and the core that helped us to get this research piece. And we spoke to Harvey, and he did an excellent job in getting this done. I look like the right screen's up now.
Okay.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Rustam. Thank you.
I guess I'm trying to work with too many screens here. So, all right. So thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, I believe as Rustam mentioned, we actually had this conversation. I think it was back towards the end of October, early November, and where we were saying that it would be important to find out what is COVID-19 doing to African Nova Scotian businesses. So the idea of doing a study to try to find that out, to answer that question, came up, and I'm glad that we actually had a chance to do it. So we were able to run, excuse me, a survey early in January. We were hoping to start it in December, but of course, Christmas time, you really can't ask people to take surveys just before Christmas. So we waited until January. We were able to get 59 businesses to participate. People are inundated with requests to engage online. So we're quite happy we were able to get just shy of 60 participants. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, based on your database, Rustam, that this might be somewhere around 20 to 25% of the number of businesses that you have in your database. I think it was close to 300 or something like that, I believe you mentioned. So we're not trying to take this information to extrapolate it to the entire population of Black businesses, but we believe that there are some useful insights that we can gain from the information. So let's see here. So I'm going to just very quickly get into, since I'm supposed to have 10 minutes, I'm going to try to just get into the meat of the matter without all of the various slides and so on. So who participated in the study? Essentially, as I mentioned, we had 59 businesses. 60% were women and 40% were men. Excuse me. One of the things that Cynthia actually mentioned earlier was that our lack of presence in a number of sectors, and you could see that by the graph over here, that we're in professional services, educational services, retail, trade. But yes, you don't see the aerospace, you don't see the high tech, you don't see the climate change, you don't see some of these areas that actually have to do with say STEM fields and so forth. So yes, clearly that is something that we would need to look at. A lot of so as you can see, a lot of the folks who participate in the study actually come from the service sector. And in that case, that service sector is typically very small. In addition to that, excuse me, we have, in terms of the age of the owners, just to show you a couple of demographics, we were not fortunate to have young entrepreneurs like under the age of 25. Just about everybody was 25 and over who participated in the study. Most of the businesses actually, if you look here, about 71% of them were under 5 years old. So I don't know if you want to call them startups or but certainly the businesses that were started very recently. And only a small percentage of them, I think it was about 18%, that were 20 years and over. And it's interesting because when we look at some of the statistics, we'll see that those are the ones that fared better than the ones that actually were younger, like 5 years or less. In terms of the number of people employed, the vast majority of them employ under 5 people. So again, kind of going back to what Cynthia mentioned, we tend to get into businesses that are relatively easy. The price of entry is relatively low. And so a lot of services, if we want to do, say, yard services or be a handy person, a painter and so forth, then it's easier to get into some of those types of businesses. So you find that those businesses do not employ large numbers of people. And then, of course, the educational level. What was interesting is that the educational level of the participants, the majority of them, I think it was almost 80% of them had a first degree or higher. So a very educated group, interesting enough to see. And then so you kind of wonder in terms of their backgrounds and the areas that they decide to actually participate in, the sectors that they decide to participate in. It would be interesting to kind of look at that to see what's the relationship between those two things. Some key findings from the research, without showing you all the fancy graphs and everything. COVID-19 clearly had a significant impact on African Nova Scotian businesses. One of the things that sort of led me to develop an interest in this particular initiative was the fact that some research was being done in the US as well to look at the impact on minority-owned businesses, businesses owned by Latinx and African Americans. And excuse me, so that sort of raised the question for me, what's happening to our businesses here in Nova Scotia? So pretty much most of the people in the survey experienced a decline in business income. So essentially the operating capacity declined over the period. And I should mention that the period that we looked at was precisely 1 year, where we look at from March 15th of 2020 and ask people to, when they were participating in January, to project until March of 2021. So we talk about prior to COVID, which would be prior to March 15th, and then during COVID, March 15th of last year to March of this year, the end of March of this year. We saw that about 63% of the participants experienced a reduction in their operating capacity. So that's a significant portion of people saying, we just had to sort of shut down. We just were not getting the business to stay open. Between 15 and 39% of them temporarily or permanently closed. In a number of cases, it seemed that they temporarily closed and then sort of reopened a bit later. 70% of them had less than 2 months of cash on hand. So again, talking about the whole issue of the need for financing, that was one of the top areas that people talked about, the need for funding. You found that 35% of them applied or less actually applied for some of the government relief programs that were available. And there were a variety of reasons why they did not participate. But the majority of folks said that they basically had to self-finance or ask family and friends for some financial support when they needed some help. Another issue was sort of meeting compliance because of all the public health protocols. And if a lot of those businesses are in services where typically your client is part of the service delivery mechanism, then it makes it relatively difficult because you have to social distance and all of those sorts of things. So that was a bit of a challenge for several of them. Continued concerns about a second and third and fourth wave, because it's sort of entrenching a loss of customers, and people lose customers during that time period. They're not sure those customers will actually come back, particularly because they're young businesses. And since they're young businesses, if people are able to find alternate suppliers for whatever their needs are, they may not necessarily come back. So that's a concern for many of them. We had also people expressing the need for increased marketing to try to boost sales. So it was a bit of a challenge, but they recognized that perhaps that could assist them. The need to expand their channels. So moving online, and not all of those businesses can transition online because of the nature of the services that they provide. So they recognize that as certainly a challenge for them. The need for financial assistance, as we talked about that a bit earlier. They may have to downsize or defer payments of expenses, rent, loans, and so forth. Continue to use personal funds to survive. 66% of them feel that it will take about another 4 to 6 months before they could return to a normal businesses. So that means over the next several months, those businesses will require funding support to continue to operate. 34% of them deemed healthy prior to COVID, prior to March of 2020. So about 34% of them said we were fairly healthy, making a good profit, and that number dropped down to 8.9% in March of towards the end of January of 2021. So a significant impact that you could see in terms of the proportion of businesses that are saying that we're no longer making a healthy profit. A percentage of businesses finding themselves at a risk of perhaps even closing or defaulting on loans and payments and so on. jumped from about 21% prior to COVID to 43%. So that's that double the proportion of participants who said that that was the situation for them. Percentage of businesses sort of classing themselves as stable sort of kind of remain about the same. I believe it was about 44% prior to COVID, about 42% after COVID. So the big shift was from healthy to at risk. And it would be interesting to find out which businesses actually just sort of actually went way from being healthy to being at risk, as opposed to maybe perhaps moving into sort of a stable holding pattern. So that would be another study that has to be done. And so here's Cynthia's sister here pointing to some of the barriers for us. We talked about what are some of the barriers to access. So a number of them, the top 5 barriers were racial attitudes. And that's a very interesting issue, because it is about people not perceiving that they could get either the same quality of work or the same quality of products. And so there is that bias, racial bias, that has to be overcome by many of our entrepreneurs. The lack of scale, and that's another issue too. As you saw, many of those businesses are small, and to really grow, there's a need to sort of figure out how can you grow the business. I think Cynthia kind of alluded to it, without actually working in the business, but working on the business, right? So which is a good point. So how can you scale the business to not just be a provincial business, but a national business or an international business? And so that clearly is an issue. The lack of wealth, you don't have a lot of intergenerational wealth. And so as a result, when people go to the banks and they don't have sufficient collateral, that makes it a bit of a challenge in terms of getting funding. And as well, there's research that actually shows that there's bias, there's racial bias in the artificial intelligence fintech models that are used to give credit and so on. So that's another issue that's on top of all of that. They felt that there were not networks that they could plug into that would kind of provide supports during that time. While the BBI is there, but I think it's like sort of looking for more peer-to-peer networks. And then, of course, limited market access. It could be both either locally or nationally or internationally. In terms of their needs to survive or to become successful, several of them mentioned that keeping their customers was a major priority because of the risk of losing them in this pandemic. Access to capital, as we've already talked about. The need for business resources, because if you're going to transition to online, then there's a need for supports to kind of create these online channels. How do you remain competitive in an environment where customers are perhaps not spending as much? So finding ways to either lower your costs or find perhaps ways in which you could come up with either new products or new services to deal with the lack of revenues coming from your traditional product stream or your service stream. Networking opportunities and affordable workspaces. So these are some of the things that were mentioned. There's some other very interesting observations, and as I started doing the sort of cross tabulations, and I don't want to get into all of them, and there's some interesting observations, particularly when you look at the gender split, or if you look at the data based on the level of or the status in terms of whether or not companies find themselves in a risky situation or they continue to operate at a healthy level and so forth. So there are a couple of quick points I want to just bring your attention to. So prior to the pandemic, 86% of male-owned businesses were considered healthy, compared to 75% for women. And then 1 year after the pandemic, 62% of male businesses consider themselves healthy or stable, and then 56% for women. So there was a decline in both of them, but you can see that in terms of the disparity, there's a larger proportion of male-owned businesses that are considered healthy or stable. Among businesses that were at risk, 61% of them were owned by women, compared to only, while 60% of the ones owned by men were considered healthy during that same period. So what you're seeing essentially is that the kinds of businesses that women are participating in that the women in the study are more susceptible to the impacts of COVID-19. And that's because a lot of them are small, they're service-based businesses, and as a result of that, a couple of the businesses that participated that were owned by men that did very well were businesses that were actually quite old. When I say quite old, they were 20 years or more. So they have established customer bases, and they were perhaps in construction. There was at least, I think, 2 construction companies. So some of those businesses were still able to function during the pandemic compared to some of the services that the women businesses were. And when we mentioned gender, as I mentioned that the women were predominantly in the service sector. For at-risk businesses, 1 year after the pandemic, 80% of them were less than 5 years old. So that tells you where most of basically the young businesses are the ones that are facing significant challenges. For those reporting healthy, 60% of them were 15 years or older. So the older businesses had more resilience, the younger businesses had less resilience in that regard. I'll be finished very shortly. And there are some other observations, again, that comes from the cross-tabulations, where, excuse me, in terms of the age of the business owners, as I mentioned, just about everybody was 25 years or older. We had 39% of men own businesses that were 15 years or older, 49% compared to 49% for women. 39% of men, sorry, compared to 22% for women. So the men tended to own the majority of the older businesses. And I think that is correlated with the fact that since the older businesses did better, the businesses owned by men also sort of weathered the pandemic better than the businesses owned by women. Prior to the pandemic, 62% of male-owned businesses earned $50,000 or more annually. That's the total annual turnover, compared to 31% of the women. And then 1 year later, it's dropped down to 52% and 22% for women. So again, just sort of demonstrating that the pandemic has had an effect. Just to close out, why did people become an entrepreneur? Very interesting that to build personal wealth, of course, but also to contribute to community and to be their own boss, and as a source of pride and as a means of combating racial discrimination in employment. Well, if you look at all of the folks who responded, for all of those categories, at least 73% felt that, sorry, that those were reasons why they participated. I'm almost done. And pursue the dream, passion is energy, feel the power that comes from focusing on what excites you. So I think that African Nova Scotian business, there's a passion there, there's a passion for entrepreneurship, but the supports are what's needed to make it work. And in terms of recommendations, we got a number of ideas from the participants, but we were able to group them into these categories. So if we were to take a sort of a very comprehensive approach to addressing this, it will lead to a sector strategy where there's a strategy for African Nova Scotian businesses that would have strategic initiatives in each of these areas: access to capital, access in markets, business networking, training and coaching and development, racial equity and justice in financing and so forth, and in terms of marketing, intersectionality of gender. That a number of participants talk about being woman and trying to be an entrepreneur at the same time. So there are issues there that we will need to explore, whether or not some of these people are actually raising families at the same time while they're trying to run a business. We don't know because the survey didn't ask that question, but it's worth exploring. And then, of course, the kinds of resources and supports that can be provided for them. In terms of additional research, there are a number of questions that we could address. Challenges faced by African Nova Scotian businesses at each stage of the business development life cycle, experiences of successful Black businesses that we can learn from, the factors influencing entrepreneurship choice. In other words, why are we underrepresented in certain areas versus others? Factors driving the lack of presence in high growth areas such as tech, climate change, healthcare, the blue economy, optimizing the Black entrepreneurship ecosystem, and that is really crucial if we're going to provide services and supports. The intersection of gender, race, physical ability, and entrepreneurship has to be studied. The critical drivers for access to and growth in international markets, effective strategies for leveraging entrepreneurial activities for social justice and social change, and effective strategies for the economic development of an enclave community. And the reason why I say enclave community is because I use this concept that we are a community, a country within a country, right? And if you're a country within a country, then you're enclaved. And if you're enclaved with open borders, how do you design your economic system so that you don't have all of your capital sweeping across your border, but finding ways to actually create that sense of community and keeping capital within that community? So these are interesting questions. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And there's lots to find out from the data, but we'll continue that work.
Thank you very much, Harvey. I think that is, this is a lot of interesting finding that you have. It's interesting to find that you have done this in the last few weeks, I would say, because you collected the data until March of 2021. Right. So, and it certainly poses a lot of new questions that you'll have to sort of start exploring as well. There are many that I can ask. I mean, we don't have a lot of time here, but I would certainly want to follow up with one. The common theme that you found was that the smaller businesses, those with less than 5 people in business, were the ones who were more affected. My really is to, did you explore whether or not these businesses could take advantage of many of the programs that the federal and the provincial governments had announced, like like wage subsidies and so on, to mitigate some of the impact of the pandemic? Or they were very resource constrained in terms of not having enough mentoring and coaching, as Cynthia was talking about earlier?
Yeah. So so the question was asked in terms of which programs they participated in, and you had actually 35% or less of the respondents actually participating in any one of those programs. So a number of them mentioned a few factors. One, that they were not mandated closures, so as a result, they couldn't access the funding. 2, that they did not generate enough income, I believe it was. Maybe there was an income criterion, and I haven't really studied all of the programs. They also mentioned that it was somewhat complicated, the application process. They needed support to actually be able to apply. There were also some that were concerned that if they were somehow mistakenly awarded funding, that the government coming back for it later on might pose challenges for them, because if they've used it, it's not like they have a bunch of money sitting there to give it back to the government. So they rather just sort of stay away from it and say, listen, I'm not getting involved with this. And then you had some people who didn't need it. They just decided that they were going to self-fund. But yeah, so not as many people as and I don't know if it's because, I mean, while they give us some of the reasons, but it would be interesting to actually look at the criteria for all of these different programs. I believe the mistake was that while those programs were put out there, that they were not unique initiatives that take into consideration the sort of cultural nuances of that community, because we don't all start from the same place.
Yeah, that's okay. That's interesting. So again, it goes back to the question of providing that mentoring for new entrepreneurs, really, which is a very critical ingredient for success as well. Well, thank you very much, Harvey. Let me move on to have a question from one of the participants, and I'm going to leave it open. Maybe we can start with Rustam to respond to this, and if others would like to, Cynthia and Harvey can provide the perspective as well. The question is that recently the Asian business community and the Asian community have been at the receiving end of violence and intolerance. From your own experience as a Black business leader who has navigated similar issues, do you have any advice to the Asian business community on how to navigate this difficult time?
Yeah. So thanks for that, and Harvey, thanks for your presentation as well. humanity is now under duress, largely because of certain elements, not least of all the former president of the United States and certain strategies. And unfortunately, by labeling the current challenges, the health challenges of COVID, which has had significant economic impact as a Chinese or Asian issue, has actually permeated into society and has now gotten to the level of the heightened level of violence that you see in particular in the US, but Canada has its similar challenges as well. That's for racially visible communities. Some of it we have borne in silent confidence. Some of it we have had to raise our voices, and we've had to march and the struggle. I say a luta continua. The struggle continues, and for our brothers in the Asian community, we understand and feel how that manifests itself. I don't think there's any Black person, regardless of who they are, how wealthy they are, or wherever they came from, who haven't experienced some form of marginalization that challenges them. And that goes into business as well. And so we find ways to survive and have sales. And our brothers and sisters in the Asian community, because we are all one, has significant challenges like that as well to overcome. The Black community have always struggled with what we do, and sometimes we even internalize that against our own. But in the long run, one of the ways that we've managed to survive is hard work and finding methods for us to work together to overcome those. Those are some of the challenges that we've had in our own life and our own society, and partnerships working with other ethnicities and other communities will also help as well, because there's a saying in the Atlantic, a rising tides rise all ships, and I think certain movements would help. I just might add, Harjeet, the current efforts with the federal government as of the budget that was announced last night, in terms of the Black entrepreneurship investment that has happened and the supporting Black communities funding. Some of those tools help. It's a good start, and it's a great movement. In communities, we know we can always say it's never enough, but it's a bold step, and I think those areas help as well. Those will be some of the comments that I can reach out to that community and indicate.
Thank you, Rustam. Yeah, that's reassuring. Yes, Cynthia, please go ahead.
And just to add on to what Rustam said, and I think the most important thing is that we're not in this by ourselves in isolation. When you saw what happened in the States last year with the killing of George Floyd, I'm sorry, it wasn't just Blacks that were coming out in droves. It was people who felt for humanity. It was people who felt for other people. I think this is not a strategy that one group over another group has to devise. I think collectively we have to come together, because this is around how we collectively work together, how we actually navigate the system together, because the barriers to success are really, there's barriers. We see it, and they're racial barriers, but until you face those barriers, until all of a sudden they're put in your face, you don't see them. But people that have navigated them in the past, when you look at our Indigenous population, when you look at our Indigenous African Nova Scotian population who have been here for hundreds of years, having to face those barriers, I think that we have to put our heads together, but we have to speak with one voice. When you're speaking with separate voices, what happens is society sometimes slices and dices. They take what they want to hear and use it and move with it, ignoring the voices of the others. And I think we have to come together in order to have a stronger voice and remove the color off the skin, because we're all going to face this. The people of color, the BIPOC community, we're facing this. This is not going to go away, but how do we work collectively together to say, what are the struggles? What are your struggles? What are our struggles? What do we want to do? And they might be slightly different, but the vast majority of them will be the same. And if we can move the yardstick on the common ground, then you can actually, and that actually moves us forward and propels us forward to look at some of the smaller strategies that might be unique to the various cultures or ethnicity that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think that's an important point. I think most of the struggles are very common. There's a lot of overlap, and we certainly have to work collectively together. Did you have anything to add, Harvey, to this?
Not much more, except that I think we have to understand why people are behaving the way they do, and sort of try to get at that root cause. And education is one tool that could be used. Forming alliances across racial boundaries, as I say, with BIPOC communities, but even people of European descent are also allies who are willing to deal with this issue. Now, we've been dealing with this for over 400 years, so it's not going to end just tomorrow. So I believe that what we've done is we've persevered in terms of one, really coming together and in unity there's strength. So we try to provide supports for each other. We support each other's causes, as Cynthia sort of alluded to, and Rasim alluded to as well. We have to do the education piece, and then we have to advocate for criminalization of racism and hatred and bigotry. So we have to also go at that from a legal standpoint as well too. So education is important, trying to change attitudes, raise awareness, creating alliances, but also to advocating for the kinds of legislation that would criminalize those behaviors.
And I think
there's a saying that I like from the mayor of Washington's wife a few years ago. She said, "All of us are born in a state of ignorance, and many of us never change residence." I think that's one of the things that's happening in society right now, that we have a lot of educating to do.
I think the intersectionality, and Harvey alluded to that in his presentation. I think we have to find those intersections of how we work together, because we will all work, but instead of reinventing the wheel each and every time, find out where our intersections are to move us forward. And that intersectionality is going to be key, because a lot of organizations are now looking at that and not just looking at one element, they're looking at the various elements and how they all correlate together.
Yeah. And I think this sort of leads us to the next question that we have from one of the participants as well. Cynthia, this is, I'd like to ask you, you did mention about systemic barriers, for Black businesses. And I think we've just talked about education. So one of the issues that is much overlooked is Black youth and the education system. I think all of you have just talked about, and it's not just Black youth only, I would say, but in general, I would say, education has become a huge hindrance. Do you believe that our schools and universities are doing enough today, or what can they do more, or what they're not?
We have to actually go back in history. These systems and the systems we're working in and living in and navigating through are systems that didn't have all voices at the table when the systems were designed. They didn't have female voices. They didn't have Black. They didn't have Indigenous. They didn't have people of color in any way, shape, or form. I think this is the time, if you're going to address it, you have to address it in a way that you're not blowing the system up. But what you have to do is you have to look at the system and really assess what is working and what is not working. You have to actually take the initiative and get rid of what is not working, because it won't work. It hasn't worked, you can see it, and look at what is working and how do we play on that? How do we build that as some of the foundational elements? But we have to acknowledge, really truly acknowledge, that we have systemic racism. And when people say the words, but their actions don't follow through, I think that's where you get the, okay, I'm hearing something, but I'm not seeing something. And so you get that despondent again from people that you think that, oh my gosh, they see it and I have an ally, and we don't. And I think as an institution, as education is the path to success. You have to allow everybody the opportunity to be successful. And when you have barriers to some people not allowing them to be successful, and Harvey alluded to this from the STEM perspective, if we look at African Nova Scotians or Indigenous population, people of color, you're probably not going to see, especially if you break it down in ethnicities a little bit more, you're not going to see certain groups there. And why is that? We have to say, is it because they can't be educated? I don't know if that's the issue. Or are there barriers to that education? So they're only given to a certain level and then navigated or moved off to another area. So having been in the system and growing up here in Nova Scotia, I can honestly say my mother, there were 6 of us in the family, and at grade 7, my mother had to go to junior high every time each of us hit grade 7 to say, my child will stay in the academic arena, because there was streaming in the school. And if your parent didn't go and advocate for you, you were streamed into non-academic areas. Those were barriers to success for these people. It wasn't that they couldn't do it. They were not given the opportunity to do it because somebody made a decision for them.
And that is the key. I think, we do need to create opportunities. Like, I think Harvey pointed that out in his presentation as well. I think Rustam talked about it as well. We need to find new ways to, create these opportunities for everybody. And I think education is the key, absolutely. And some of the sectors that you were talking about, I think they are, whether it's IT or whether it's aerospace, or engineering sectors and so on, that is a significant barrier, really, in some sense, I would say, Well, unfortunately, I was looking at the clock, and we are almost out of time. I'm aware of the time that we were given an hour to go to talk about this important topic. That's all the time we have, unfortunately, today for this discussion. I would like to first take this opportunity to thank Cynthia and Rustam and Harvey, for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. It is very, very informative and very insightful. I'm sure that the participants are taking away a lot from today's webinar as well. I thank all of you also for joining. I hope that you found this to be a very interesting presentation and very impactful for your communities. Please visit the Sobey School network site. It's the Sobey School ProsperityNetwork.com, and sign up for the newsletter email list. It's the easiest way to get the latest advice from our experts, as well as register for our upcoming conversation series, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning. So it's a 3-part conversation. The second of the conversation series will focus on barriers to doing business for Black entrepreneurs, access to capital markets. So we've talked about that a little bit today, but we're going to be focusing the second webinar on this particular topic entirely next time. Registrations for all webinars is on the network website under the upcoming events tab. So please make sure that you register, well in advance. Finally, if you have any further questions about the topic presented today, please contact us through the website. There's a contact page available where you can give us your comments. I hope that you all have had a terrific day today. I want to thank you again for participating and joining in this webinar. And thanks again to our panelists. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Thanks, Ajit.